Hello, I'm Carlton Van Putten, founder and CEO of PayRent. Welcome to the Keys to Success podcast, where we unlock the secrets to smarter investments, smoother tenant management, and bigger profits, one episode at a time. Ready to master your property game? Let's dive in.
Welcome to Keys to Success, where we unlock better property management one step at a time. Today, we're digging into something that, well, it pops up pretty often for landlords.
Okay.
What do you do when your current tenant asks to add someone new to their lease?
Oh, yeah, that's definitely a common one. Life changes, a roommate leaves, maybe someone needs a hand with the rent, or sometimes a family member or even a caretaker needs to move in. For the tenant, it often solves a real problem.
And for you, the landlord, knowing how to handle it the right way is, well, it's fundamental. It's more than just a yes or no. It's really about protecting your property, keeping the rent coming in reliably, and making sure everything stays legal and above board. We actually have a great guide to walk us through this today, shared by a listener. It's called Adding a Tenant to Your Lease, a complete guide.
Yeah, it looks pretty comprehensive. So our goal today is to unpack this guide, pull out the really important bits, and translate that into clear, practical advice specifically for you, the landlord. What does this guide say is really essential when that request lands on your desk?
Okay, let's get into it then. The guide kicks off by looking at why this is such a big deal from your perspective, the landlord's view. We get the tenant side, keeping the place full, rent paid, maybe helping someone out. But what's the core landlord angle here?
For you, it really boils down to continuity and managing risk. Think about it. If a roommate leaves, you might face a vacancy, or the person left behind might struggle with the full rent amount.
Right.
So bringing in a new qualified tenant, and that's the key part, if it's done right, helps keep the unit occupied and secures that rent payment stream.
So it can be a win-win.
Yeah.
But the material we looked at is super clear on this. Any addition has to be formally approved and documented by you. Why is just letting it slide, informally such a bad idea?
Huge risk. Because look, without your official approval and without that new person being formally on the lease agreement, they're basically an unauthorized occupant.
Okay.
They have zero legal obligation to you, none. They aren't bound by the lease rules, the payment terms, any of it. It leaves you really exposed legally and makes enforcing anything almost impossible. Getting them formally added means they're legally recognized, they're accountable under your lease.
That makes complete sense.
Okay.
So before anyone even thinks about moving boxes in, you need to get your legal ducks in a row. What's the absolute first thing the guide says you got to do?
You start with the contract. You already have the original lease agreement for that specific unit.
Dig it out.
Yeah, pull it out, read it through again carefully. Does it mention anything specific about occupancy limits? Is there a set procedure spelled out for adding tenants or making changes, amendments? Most leases will have clauses on this, often stating a max number of people or requiring your written okay for any changes.
And it's not just about what your lease says, is it? The guide makes a big point about local housing codes being just as important, maybe even more so.
Absolutely critical. Overcrowding isn't just a potential lease violation. It can be a direct violation of city or county ordinances. These codes usually set maximum occupancy based on things like square footage or number of bedrooms.
Right.
If you go over those limits, you could be looking at hefty fines from the local authorities. In some cases, it might even be grounds for terminating the lease. But the key is, you have to be the one managing this proactively. You absolutely must know the legal occupancy limit for your specific unit under local law.
That feels like a trap someone could easily fall into if they're not careful. Okay, and then the communication part. The guide is really firm. Tenant's request needs to be written. Your answer, yes or no, also written.
Yeah, no shortcuts here, no verbal agreements. A written request from the tenant gives you a formal starting point. It's documented. And your written reply, especially if it's an approval, is just as vital. It creates that clear legal record that you've consented. It protects you. It sets the stage for what comes next. It just validates the whole process.
And sticking with local stuff for a sec, the guide points out that adding someone isn't always just a simple name swap on the lease. It might trigger other things locally, like
Yeah.
rent control issues.
That's a really, really key point, especially depending on where your property is located. In some areas, adding another person might actually allow for a rent increase, maybe to cover increased wear and tear or higher utility use if you cover those.
Okay.
Or it could trigger a mandatory inspection by the city. And if you're in a rent-controlled area, forget about it. The rules are often much stricter. Adding a tenant could fall under very specific regulations about who can live there, how or if the rent can be adjusted at all. You've got to be completely clear on your local municipal laws before you even think about saying yes.
All right, super important homework there. Okay, so let's say you've checked the lease, you know the local rules,
Yeah.
you've got the tenant's written request. What's the actual step-by-step process the guide suggests you follow now?
Well, it really starts with just clear, open communication. Talk to your existing tenant, or tenants if there's more than one. You need them to clearly explain why they want this and give you the details about the person they're proposing.
Mm-hmm.
And just as importantly, you need to clearly lay out your process for them. What steps you require, what you need to do next. Manage their expectations.
Which leads us to probably the most crucial step from your side, that tenant screening. The guide basically says requiring a full rental application from this potential new tenant is like non-negotiable.
Absolutely fundamental. Think about it. You're bringing someone new into a legal contract with you, putting them into your asset, your property. That application needs to be thorough. You need employment verification, you need to run a credit check, get their rental history, and actually call those previous landlords, Nick.
I should call them, yeah.
Yeah, and get their explicit consent in writing for you to run a background check. The aim is simple. Vet this person just as strictly as you would any brand new applicant walking in off the street. You need to be confident they're reliable, financially sound, and not likely to cause problems.
So even though they're sort of piggybacking onto an existing lease, they still have to clear the same bar.
Exactly the same bar. This screening is your main defense against future headaches. It ensures they meet your standards, and it gives you that crucial documentation showing you did your due diligence, which is important legally, too.
Okay, makes sense. So you've screened them, they pass muster, you're ready to move forward. The guide talks about having two options then. Either adding an amendment to the current lease, or maybe tearing it up and creating a whole new lease for everyone. What does the guide say tends to be the preferred route, especially for property management companies?
Yeah, the guide indicates there's a pretty strong preference for using a lease amendment, or sometimes it's called an addendum, to the original lease.
Okay, and why is that usually the way to go?
Generally, it's just quicker and more efficient. An amendment focuses only on the necessary changes. So mainly adding the new tenant's name, but also maybe clarifying things like utility responsibilities if they're changing, or confirming parking spots, that sort of thing.
Gotcha.
All the original terms and conditions of that lease, they just stay in place. That gives you continuity, and it's legally simpler than drafting and executing a whole new contract from scratch.
So amendment it is, usually. What specific information must be in that amendment document to make sure it's solid, legally speaking?
The guide's pretty clear here. It absolutely must list the full legal names of everyone who will be living in the unit and on that lease. That means the original tenant and the new person being added.
Everyone.
Everyone. It needs to clearly state if there are any changes to the rent obligation, any updated rules about occupancy, and spell out any shifts in who's responsible for what regarding maintenance or repairs, if that applies.
And nailing down the money side is obviously key.
Absolutely critical. The amendment needs to explicitly outline the total financial obligations that all the tenants on that lease are now collectively responsible for. So the total monthly rent amount, who pays utilities, any other fees from the original lease. And it should also probably reiterate or confirm the full remaining time left on the lease term so everyone's clear on the commitment length.
And how do you make sure that amendment actually, holds water legally?
Signatures. It has to be signed by every single person involved. That means you, the landlord, all of the original tenants already on that lease, and the new tenant coming in. Once everyone signs, then it becomes a legally binding change to the original contract.
What about a security deposit? That's got to come up when you add someone.
It definitely does. The guide mentions you can ask for an additional security deposit, especially if adding a person increases the total number of occupants. More people can mean more potential wear and tear, right? But the really critical point the guide makes is that once that new tenant is signed onto the lease via the amendment, they become jointly responsible for everything in that lease, paying the full rent, following all the rules, and being liable for the property's condition.
That brings us perfectly to understanding the new tenant's role, but specifically through your eyes as the landlord managing this. The guide really highlights a crucial legal term here, joint and several liability.
Yeah, this is probably one of the most powerful clauses for a landlord in a lease with multiple tenants. It's vital you understand it when adding someone. Joint and several liability basically means that each individual tenant on that lease can be held legally responsible for the entire rent amount due and for the full cost of any damages to the property. It doesn't matter who actually caused the damage or whose share of the rent wasn't paid.
Wow, okay, so let me make sure I've got this. If you have, say, 3 tenants on the lease and 2 of them just disappear or stop paying, you can legally pursue that one remaining tenant for 100% of the unpaid rent and 100% of the damage cost.
That is exactly what joint and several liability means. And as the guide points out, that gives you, the landlord, a really significant layer of financial security. It also fundamentally shifts the dynamic among the tenants, you see, because now they all have a very strong incentive to make sure everyone else pays their share and follows the rules. If one person messes up, the others know they could be left holding the entire bag.
That's a really powerful point for landlords to grasp. What other responsibilities does the guide say you need to make sure are crystal clear for that new tenant coming in?
Well, the basics, like property rules and how maintenance works, don't just assume the existing tenants will give them the full rundown or that they'll just pick it up.
Right.
Be explicit. Talk about trash and recycling schedules, how they should submit repair requests, any rules about common areas if applicable, noise policies, things like that. Being transparent right from the start helps prevent confusion and, frankly, potential conflicts later on. It's better for everyone.
And okay, so the new tenant gets the standard rights, habitable housing, privacy, etc., but they are also completely bound by every single term in that lease agreement you have them sign.
Exactly. They are now a full legal party to that contract. They have to stick to every single term and condition laid out in the original lease and any signed amendments, no exceptions.
The guide also flags reviewing your own insurance coverage when you add a tenant. Why is that important?
Because adding more people can definitely impact your insurance needs and coverage. You need to check your landlord insurance policy. Does it have limits based on occupancy? Do you need to inform them? Some policies might even require you to specifically list all adult residents by name.
And that ties back to the joint and several liability idea too, I guess.
It does, exactly. That collective responsibility often extends to liability for things like injuries or damages that might happen on the property. Typically, all tenants named on the lease are jointly liable. The guide strongly recommends just giving your insurance provider a call before you finalize adding the tenant. Confirm your coverage is still adequate and understand if there are any changes needed on your end.
Makes sense. Now, beyond the legal docs and the money, the guide also touches on the importance of sort of the human element, clear communication between you, the original tenants, and the new person.
Yeah, this is about managing expectations, really. While that joint and several liability makes them all responsible to you for the whole amount, the tenants themselves still need to figure out their internal setup.
How they split it up.
Right. How they're going to split the rent among themselves, who's paying which utility bill if they're separate, how they'll handle chores or internal maintenance stuff. It's vital everyone is on the same page about those internal logistics.
The guide suggests a good way to help make that happen.
A pre-move-in meeting is a great idea. Get everyone together, you, the existing tenant, the new tenant, before they officially move in. Sit down, walk through the key lease terms again, talk about how rent gets paid to you, go over the property rules, answer questions. Just getting everyone aligned up front can head off a lot of potential arguments or confusion down the line.
Okay. Now, sometimes tenants might float other ideas besides formally adding someone to the lease. The guide mentions a couple of alternatives that you, as the landlord, still need to know about and usually approve.
Yeah, one common one is subletting. This is typically meant to be temporary. The original tenant basically rents out their room or the whole unit to someone else for a period.
Right.
It almost always requires your written permission as the landlord, and there's usually a separate legal document involved, a sublease agreement. But the key thing from your perspective is that the original tenant usually remains the one primarily responsible to you under the main lease terms.
Okay, so they're still on the hook. And the other thing mentioned was a roommate agreement.
Right. And this is quite different. A roommate agreement is purely an informal contract between the tenants themselves.
It's just between them.
Exactly. It lays out their internal rules, rent split, utilities, chores, maybe house rules about guests or quiet hours, whatever they agree on. It can be really helpful for them to avoid conflicts. But, crucially, it has zero legal impact on your relationship with them as the landlord. Your binding contract is the lease signed by everyone named on it. You should know these agreements might exist, but don't ever confuse them with something that changes your lease.
Good distinction. Okay, let's pivot slightly and hit some common questions landlords probably have, drawing from the guide's FAQ section. First big one. Can you just say no? Can you refuse to add the person your tenant wants?
Yes, you absolutely can refuse, but you need a valid, legal, non-discriminatory reason that's based on your lease terms or the law. The guide points to two main acceptable reasons. One, if adding the person would push the unit over its legal occupancy limit.
We talked about that.
Yep. Or two, if the prospective tenant fails your standard, consistently applied screening criteria, bad credit, terrible rental history, something concerning on the background check, just make sure your reason is legitimate and documented, and consult your lease and local laws.
And is that lease addendum, that formal paper, really essential? Or can you just, make a note somewhere?
Essential is definitely the word the guide uses. It's the official legal way you update the contract to include the new person. It clarifies everyone's duties and gives you legal standing. Without it, trying to hold that new person accountable becomes really difficult, maybe impossible, and it absolutely must be signed by everyone involved.
Okay. What about raising the rent when someone new moves in? Can you do that?
Often, yes. The guide acknowledges it's pretty common and sometimes justifiable because, well, more people can mean more wear and tear, higher utility usage if included, etc. And this is but you absolutely have to check your local rent control laws first. Those might severely limit or even prohibit rent increases in this situation. So check local rules very, very carefully.
Let's just hammer home that joint and several liability concept one more time for clarity. What's the absolute core takeaway for a landlord there?
The core takeaway is your right, as the landlord, to hold any single tenant on that lease responsible for the full amount of rent owed and the full cost of any damages, no matter who caused it or whose share it was supposed to be. They are collectively and individually liable to you for the whole thing.
Okay. What if the tenants want to work out the security deposit among themselves? Like the new person pays the old roommate directly.
The guide says you can handle the deposit logistics in different ways, sure. But however it's managed, it must be clearly spelled out in that lease amendment. You could collect an additional deposit directly from the new tenant, or the tenants can sort it out internally. The vital part for you is that the amendment clearly states the total deposit amount you're holding and reiterates that all tenants on the lease are jointly responsible for any deductions from that deposit at the end of the tenancy.
And running that fresh credit and background check on the new person, really recommend it.
Highly recommended, yes. That completed application they give you. That's your cue to run the full screening. It's your best chance to verify they're reliable and reduce potential future problems. Don't skip it just because they're joining mid-lease.
What happens if you somehow mess up and let the number of people go over the legal occupancy limit? What are the risks?
They can be pretty serious. The guide warns it could be a lease violation itself, maybe even letting tenants break the lease without penalty. But more likely, you could face significant fines from your local housing authority. They might even issue orders demanding you fix the situation, which could mean forcing someone to move out. Know your limit, stick to it.
And down the road, what if a tenant needs to come off the lease? Is that possible?
It is possible, yes. But again, It's not automatic. It requires another formal lease amendment process. That amendment would need to be signed by you and all the tenants who are staying, explicitly removing the departing person and clarifying the ongoing responsibilities of those remaining. It definitely needs your consent as the landlord.
So managing this whole thing smoothly really comes down to having good procedures and maybe some tools. What resources or best practices does the guide suggest for landlords?
Yeah, the guide mentions several helpful things. There are online platforms now that offer templates for lease agreements and those crucial addendums, which can simplify the paperwork.
Right.
Tenant screening services are obviously invaluable for doing those background and credit checks properly. And property management software can be great for keeping all your communications, documents, rent payments, everything organized and accessible in one place.
Any people resources recommended?
Absolutely. Talking to a real estate attorney is never a bad idea, especially if the situation feels complicated or, like we mentioned, if you're in a place with tricky rules like rent control. Also, local landlord associations, often fantastic resources. They can provide advice, maybe template documents specific to your area, and help you understand local laws. The guide actually name drops a few, like the National Association of Realtors, the American Apartment Owners Association, and some service platforms like RentPrep and Azebo. And then in terms of just good habits, best practices, the guide really hammers on documentation, documentation, documentation.
Keep everything.
Keep everything. Keep all those signed lease amendments filed securely right alongside the original lease. Archive the completed rental application from the new tenant. And crucially, keep a written record. Emails are great for this, of all your correspondence about adding the tenant. Every step, if it wasn't written down, it basically didn't happen from a legal standpoint.
And at that point about rent-controlled cities, worth saying one more time.
Definitely worth repeating. If your property is in a rent-controlled area, the guide is very clear. Seriously consider consulting with an attorney or maybe a local legal aid office that specializes in housing before you make any changes to your lease, including adding someone. Making sure you're fully compliant with those specific, often very complex regulations is just critical to avoid potentially huge problems and penalties.
Okay, so boiling it all down, what's the core message from this guide? What are the absolute must-dos when handling a request to add a tenant?
It really comes down to three things: good planning, meticulous documentation, and strict legal compliance. The guide makes it crystal clear. Following a proper, defined process and using a correctly executed lease amendment protects everyone. It protects you, the landlord, it protects your original tenants, and it protects the new person coming in. It just formalizes everything and minimizes risk all around.
So adding a new tenant, it might seem like a simple enough request on the surface. But as we've kind of unpacked today based on this really useful guide, doing it the right way involves several pretty crucial steps in getting that paperwork solid. But it doesn't need to be overly stressful if you just have that clear process mapped out.
Exactly right. And hopefully our exploration today helped provide some of that clarity, giving you more confidence to handle this if and when it comes up for you.
Absolutely. So think about everything we've discussed, especially that really powerful legal concept of joint and several liability. Here's a little something to maybe mull over. Beyond just the legal power it gives you, what are the less obvious ways that clause might actually encourage better behavior and maybe even stronger communication between your tenants? And how could that ripple effect ultimately benefit you as the landlord? Definitely something to think about.
That's an interesting angle to consider, the social dynamics it creates.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us for this exploration on keys to success. We hope this look at the guide helps you manage your properties just a little bit better.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Keys to Success. I invite you to check out past episodes and follow us on your favorite podcast platform to get notified when new ones are released. And when you're ready to simplify managing your properties, be sure to visit us at www.payrent.com.